Hey everyone, welcome to today's class where we're going to be taking a look at methods for modeling in Blender. We're going to take some basic objects that you might be familiar with from more beginner level lessons and bring them into the scene to create a little bit more advanced objects, bringing some more modifiers into play, and in general, taking multiple steps to eventually build out a full room scale scene complete with lighting, a few different objects, and room for a lot of flexibility to add your own creative flair. So we're back in Blender here with the default cube, our camera, and a lamp over here. And I want to start with pretty much a clear scene. So I'm going to select all these by holding Shift and left clicking on them and then pressing X to delete them. And then if you forgot to rotate your viewport, you can just hold down on your middle mouse wheel and that will allow to rotate around your viewport. If you're working on a laptop or you don't have a mouse, then you can click in this top right area here and just drag that around to rotate your viewport. But again, I highly recommend you get a mouse. So to get started with this floor lamp, we're going to add in a circle to our scene. So I'm going to press Shift A and add a mesh circle. Usually when you're creating objects, you want to start with something that's the closest resembling what you want to create. And I think for the base of this lamp, I'd like it to be sort of just a cylindrical object. So I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode where we can see all 32 vertices that are making up that circle. And then I'm going to press F to make it a face. And then what I can do is press E and Z. By default, when you press E, it will move along the normal. So in that case, it kind of was the Z axis. But if I want to go straight up, I can press Z and just go till it's about the shape that I want. And then we've got a cylinder there. So we could have started with a cylinder, but I tend to like starting with circles because now I know my origin point is right down here in the bottom. So this is working good for our base, but what I want to do next is add sort of an arm that we can attach the lampshade to. So I want that arm to start sort of in the middle up here, and rather than creating the object at the 3D cursor in the middle of our scene here, I want to create it right here. So what I can do is press Tab to go back into edit mode, and then just make sure that these top vertices are selected. If they're not, you could just go into your face select mode up here and select that top face, and then press Shift S. And then this will bring up the snap menu where you can move your cursor to different areas or your selections to different areas. So I'm going to snap my cursor to selected, which will place it right in the middle of all that geometry that's currently selected. So what I'll do now is tab back out of edit mode because I want to make a new object. So you want to make new objects in object mode and edit objects in edit mode. So I'm going to press Shift A and I just really want a singular point here. So I'm going to start with a plane. And then what I'll do is just press Tab and then scale that plane all the way down to 0. And I'll actually just type in 0 on my number pad here. So what I have now is just a single point that's resting right there. And you can't really see it because it is just a single point. But we do actually still have 4 different points here. So if I select one of those points, you'll see that we have all of them. And I only really want the one at the bottom. So I moved those other ones out of the way so I could just delete those. Or after we scale this all down to 0, we can press A to make sure everything is selected, even though there's not much to see. And then right click and do merge vertices by distance. So what that's going to do is basically find vertices that are on top of each other and merge them together. And you'll see down here in the bottom, it says it removed 3 vertices. So now we just have this single one. So what we're creating now is the arm of our lamp that's going to kind of come up and over. So I'll press E, and then with that still selected, I'll press Z so it goes straight up, just until we have it kind of coming up to a nice height. And then I'll press E again, but I'm going to do this in front view because I want to make sure it goes directly out to the side. So I'm going to press 1 on my number pad. And remember, if you don't have the number pad, you could just click this Y button right here. So then I'll press E to extrude this straight out. You can press E and X, or another trick for extruding along axes is to press E and then click your middle mouse wheel once, and that will start to go along whatever axes it's near. So I'm going to undo those. So to give this arm of the lamp a little bit of depth, we want to kind of skin it with geometry, and there's a modifier just for that, and it's called the skin modifier. So what I can do is go into my modifiers properties here and add a modifier, and that's going to be a skin modifier. Now these are arranged alphabetically, so if you start to lose track of where they are, that's a good way to remember exactly where they are. So the skin modifier is right up here next to our trusty solidify modifier, and you can see what the skin modifier does. So now rather than having to mess with sort of all the vertices that we see here in our wireframe mode, we just have one that we can mess with. And now when we move this around, it's going to update dynamically. And that's one of the powerful things about working with modifiers. So we've got that looking right. I'm going to switch back into my solid view here. And the way I can switch between these views quickly is by pressing Z, and then if you drag over and click, you can go into wireframe or material preview or even rendered view. And once you get familiar with those, you can press Z and just slide over really quickly, and that'll allow you to quickly switch between them. So this is looking a little bit thicker than I'd like. So in the skin modifier, if we go into edit mode, you'll see that each vertex has a radius, X and Y. Now, I'm gonna go into my X-ray mode here. Again, the option for that is up here, or the shortcut is Alt-Z, so that I can actually see all my vertices. So if I select them all, I can press Control-A, and that is gonna control sort of how thick this arm is. So I can move that in and out until it feels just about right. And you'll also see that updating over here. You could update these individually if you were interested in doing that, but I typically, when I'm using the skin modifier, want it to be even. So that's looking good. Now let's do another very simple object over here where we're going to create sort of a shade for our lamp. So I want to move my cursor to that location, so I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode, select that one vertex on the end, Shift S, cursor to selected, then tab out of edit mode, and I can add in another circle. So I'll add a circle there, press Tab to go into edit mode, E to extrude it down, Z to make sure it's going straight down, and then S to bring it out a little bit until we sort of have a nice shape there. Now I might just want to move this down a little bit. And then maybe in this object, I could actually also create a little bit of a chord. Now, rather than going straight down, I want this to be a separate object within edit mode. So I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate this vertex and then just move it down till it's kind of where the chord would land. And then I'll press E and Z to go up. And then with this whole piece selected, I can press Control A and just drag my mouse wheel in so that that's a little bit thinner and we have a chord here. Now I want to add a little bit more detail to this floor lamp. So it's looking okay now. If you're feeling comfortable with where it's at, feel free to stop right there, but I want to smooth out this weight object, and I'd also like to control the way that this lamp kind of curves right here. In edit mode here, I could press Control B, and that's not going to do much because by default the bevel command, which is Control B, is trying to bevel edges. But if I press V, if you actually look along the bottom of the screen here, and I'm pointing if you can see that, but there's a lot of actual options there of what can do, and that's the case for many things in Blender. So if I press V, I will start to bevel vertices. And this is what the bevel command does, similar to what the bevel modifier does, but you could also just scroll upwards and then you would get about the shape you want. That's going to add in some more dimension to it. So you could leave it at something like that if you like, and that looks great. Now another way to add bevel, of course, is with the bevel modifier, and that's a little bit more dynamic. So I'm going to add in a modifier, and we'll make that a bevel modifier, which you can see by default is working properly, but maybe I don't want to bevel the bottom here. So there's actually another really cool tool within the bevel modifier, and that's to control where the bevel is happening. So by default, it's just looking for angles that are greater than 30 degrees, which would include these 90-degree angles at the bottom and sides. But I wanted to just have it be on the top here. So what I can do in edit mode is to select those top vertices, and then I could change the bevel weight, which is right here, mean bevel weight, to 1. And it still looks like everything's getting beveled, and that's because we need to change this limit method type from angle to weight. And now we can see that it's just the area that has the weight applied that's getting the bevel. Now I can adjust this to a value I like by bringing that up and maybe adding some more segments and then shading it smooth. Now, if you remember from our previous lessons, when we shade things smooth, sometimes the smooth shading doesn't work very well, and that's because it's trying to smooth this really big edge. But if I instead do shade auto smooth, then that's going to detect kind of, Blender will sort of do a good job of assuming what you want to be sharp and what you want to be smooth. Now let's just say we wanted to, maybe we decided we wanted our lamp to go sort of up at a different angle. So we wanted to select this bottom and then bring this down, but now it kind of messed up our curve. So this isn't a reason why you wouldn't necessarily want to usually use the bevel command if you can avoid it. For quick things, like if I just wanted to add a bevel at the bottom here, the bevel command works great for that. And maybe we don't need quite so much definition. It's good for that, but for something like this where you're maybe not totally sure what you want your final shape to be and you want some flexibility, then using the bevel modifier is a lot better. So in my vertex select mode, let's actually just remove these ones and sort of repeat that process, but in a more procedural way. So let's bring this up and then bring this over. And then now what I can do is add back in so I already had the skin modifier on this object, but you sort of realize that it disappeared from this edge. So sometimes in the skin modifier, you need to mark roots. That's just so Blender knows where to start that skin modifier. And then rather than adding the bevel like I did before with the Control B command, I'm going to do that a better way procedurally with the bevel command. Now in the bevel command, it's going to by default be looking for edges to bevel. So if we go back into our solid view, we can see that it is beveling the edges, but we don't want to bevel those edges. We want to bevel the vertex at this edge right here. So I'm going to change this from edges to vertices, and now it's trying to bevel every single vertex that's being created by the skin modifier. So this is a really important time to note that modifiers work in order. So we have the skin modifier at the top here, and then the bevel is being applied. So we actually want this the other way around. We want that single vertex to be beveled, and then we want to kind of add some dimension to this with the skin modifier. So in the modifiers tab, what I can do is just click and drag up until that is at the top. And now we have control over this bevel value, and it's much more dynamic. So if we add some more segments here, then we'd be able to make that change we did just earlier, and the bevel is going to update dynamically. So that's a much better way to work with modeling in Blender if you can sort of think ahead to what you're going to be doing and work a little bit more dynamically. And it just also gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of creativity, where you can sort of make changes as you go if you see something's not working the way you like. So just to finish this off, I want to add in maybe a subdivision surface modifier at the end of this, because by default, the skin modifier is really just creating a box around your object. But using the subdivision modifier will sort of smooth that out a little bit. And you might notice that if you try to right click and shade that smooth, it doesn't work. And that's because there's sort of a quirky thing with the skin modifier where you have to check smooth shading in the modifier right there. So let's just maybe move this down so it's going into our base a little bit better. And then let's maybe also add in a solidify modifier to this object so that we just have a little bit of thickness. And then we could also even add in a subdivision surface here and maybe a few edge loops, just so that we have a little bit more of a nice organic lamp shape. And this is a great opportunity to play around with exactly what you want your lamp shape to be. The subdivision surface modifier obviously allows us a lot of flexibility with changing those shapes. But I think a good shape like that is working for me. So that's about all with this lamp. Now, one thing I do want to make note of is, since we're going to be putting this into a larger scene, it's important to be working in a little bit of a real world scale. So the way that we can control what the scale of our scene is in Scene Units tab. So this little cone with the dots in it is the Scene tab. And then under Units, you can see right now we're working with the metric system, which for many of you is probably exactly what you want to do. But for someone such as myself, we use the imperial system. I know, don't shame me. But we want to, I'm going to add in basically, I'm going to imagine that, a person maybe standing beside this would be about 6 feet tall. So our cube has been added right at the top of our scene there. I'm just going to bring it down to the floor, and then I can see the dimensions of that right here in this sidebar. And again, if you lost that bar, you can press N to bring it up. So I'm just going to bring this up until it's about 6 feet tall, so that we can imagine that that's a person. So something about like that. And then I'll just, in my front view, make sure that's sitting right. And we can see that our lamp is way too big. So I'm just going to select all these objects and scale them down. But I don't really want it to scale right there. So I want it to scale sort of about this point. So now would be a good time to press Shift C to snap our cursor back to the middle of the scene, select these objects, and then to scale them about that cursor, I can press period, and that will change the pivot point basically. So I want to scale about the 3D cursor. So I'm going to scale these down just until our lamp is about the size of that person. So someone standing next to it, it would be right about at their eye level, which is about how big a floor lamp like this might be. So then what I want to do, remember, is you don't want your scales to be off here, and that's really important when you're working with modifiers. So I'm going to press Control A and apply my scale, which you can see now throws off our modifiers a little bit, but that's really easy to get back. So I'm just going to rescale all of this down, and then in the bevel, I'll pull this back in quite a bit until it's right where I want it. So it was like 6 feet that it was trying to bevel. So we can bring that way back down. Maybe you just want to type in a value here, like 6 inches. And then maybe we just bring that up a little bit. So that's looking better. And then the bevel here, we could also make the same adjustment. Maybe that's a 1 inch bevel. Or maybe it's a little bit bigger. That's looking good. And then this is looking way too fat at the top. So let's bring that in too. And now we've got a properly scaled lamp next to our box person over here, but we'll delete that person. Okay, so the last thing you might want to do once you've got all these parts here is just consider naming them, just so that it's a little bit easier to organize your scene, especially once you start putting this in with other objects. So I'm going to press F2 to rename this object the base, and then I'll press F2 to name this the arm, and then I'll press F2, or you could also double click up here in the outliner to rename this the shade, just so that we have those objects. And then another thing I might do is just maybe select all of them and then select the base last. So anytime you're selecting multiple objects, the one with the lighter colored orange outline, that's the active object. So that's sort of the last one we selected. I'm gonna press Control P and parent them. So I'll parent that to the object. Now if I ever move this base around, everything else will come with it and we don't have separate objects. So that's a really convenient way to make sure things are just a little bit more organized. Now feel free to have plenty of flexibility here with what this design actually looks like. Like I mentioned, I sort of knew the direction I wanted to go with this, but feel free to play around with the shape of the shade, the shape of the arm, the base. There's really a lot of flexibility here, and I'm excited to see what you create. So join me in the next lesson where we're going to do some subdivision modeling, just a little bit of a different modeling technique, slightly more advanced, but great for creating curved objects. And what we're actually going to be making is a chair object with sort of a wood frame and a nice soft cushion. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. Join me there and we'll get started soon. Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be creating a chair model using subdivision surface modeling techniques, which is a little bit different than what we've been doing so far and is a great way to create more organic shapes like the cushions in the chair we're creating. So subdivision surface modeling is basically a method by which we create a cage object, and then that is automatically smoothed in Blender, so that rather than having to control hundreds of faces, we're controlling very basic shapes, and the subdivision surface modifier will smooth them out. So we're in our scene with our lamp here. I'll make sure that I've saved that, and then I'm gonna add in a new object, which will be our chair object. So before I get started, I'm gonna press File and Save As, and I'll save that as lamp and chair, and save the file. So I want to move this sort of out of the way. So I'm going to select all these objects and press M and move them to a new collection, which I will call the lamp, so that those objects are now in their own collection. And I can uncheck that here so that it's hidden. But while I'm getting started with my chair, I'll leave it on just so that I can make sure we're working at about the right scale. So I'm going to press Shift A and add in a cube. And then I'll leave that in the middle, but maybe we slide our lamp a little bit out of the way. And then I'll move this up so that it's sitting right on our floor. And I want the seat height of our chair to be about 18 inches, which is pretty common. So I can look over here and see that this is now 2 feet tall, which is about 24 inches. But in edit mode, I could also actually add in some edge length options. So you can see right there that those are our edge lengths. So I'm just gonna move this top plane down a little bit until we're at about 18 inches, which is 1.5 feet. And you can actually control the units over here from feet to inches. And my math was correct, that's 18 inches. So we've got our basic cushion shape there. I'll just move this up off the floor, and then I'll also turn off my edge length option. Now I'm going to duplicate this object in my side view and sort of create a bit of a back for the chair. You can see that we're still rotating about the cursor though from the previous lesson. So I'm going to press period and change our rotation to median point, which is typically what you'd want it on by default. So I'm just going to move this up into place, and then grabbing this edge, I'll sort of pull this out a tad, and I'm just creating a general shape for our chair here. Maybe moving this cushion down. But really the bulk of what we're doing is subdivision surface. So these cushions obviously right now are not very smooth at all. So we're gonna add in our trusty subdivision surface modifier, which you can see completely wrecks the mesh, but it does smooth it out quite a bit. Now, if you remember, the viewport levels is what you see in the viewport, and the render levels are how many levels get rendered. Sometimes you want the viewport levels to be a little bit lower than the render levels, just so that your viewport operates a little bit faster, but I typically like to leave them the same. So I'm gonna bump this up to maybe something like a 3, And then I can really start shaping this out. Now I'm going to be doing changes on both sides of my object, but this is a symmetrical object in the case of the chair that I have planned. So I'm actually going to just press Ctrl R to add an edge loop right here and right here. And then I'm actually going to delete this side, because what we can do, and I'm actually going to delete those vertices, what we can do is add in a mirror modifier so that things we do on one side will happen also on the other side. So that modifier is right there. Remember, those are in alphabetical order if you lose track of where they are. And now what I can do is just start moving things around sort of with the mirror modifier on, and it will happen on both sides. So remember our hotkey Ctrl R to add edge loops, and then maybe another edge loop right here. And then the power of subdivision surface modifying is now that, even though we're working with a pretty basic shape, I could like shape this out a little bit more right here. So maybe we move this down, maybe we move this over. And we'll notice that that's actually not a nice smooth transition between. And that's because there's an option in the subdivision surface modifier that we need to enable, which is clipping as well as merge. That'll make sure that they merge those together, but also that you can't go through your sort of mirror plane. Now, there's another thing that if you remember from the lamp lesson, modifiers work in order. So we're actually getting the model subdivided and then it's being mirrored. So we need to instead have it be mirroring the base mesh and then subdividing it. And now we have a little bit more of our expected result. So I might just pull this whole thing in, and because we have that clipping option on, it's going to not go through it. And then we can just make some general adjustments to the shape here. Maybe this part comes out a little bit. Maybe we look at our top view, make this a little bit more curved until we just sort of have a nice shaped object. Maybe we want the bottom of our chair to be a little bit flatter. And maybe we add in another edge loop here towards the front, just so that the front of our chair maybe has a little bit more cushion to it. And I think that something like that is looking pretty good. So let's right click and shade that smooth. So what I want to do next is add in a simple frame to our chair, and I'll do that using similar techniques I did on the lamp over here using the skin modifier. So what I'll do is, first let's just hide that lamp. Now that we know it's looking about the size we want for our scene, let's uncheck it over here, and we now just have our object alone in the scene. So I'll press F2 while I'm working just to keep things a little bit more organized and rename that to chair cush for a chair cushion. And I want to now add in, like I mentioned, a frame to this object. So this is going to be a familiar process. We're just going to add in a cube, and then I'll bring this up until it's right sort of sitting on the ground there. And then I'll move this over. And then I want to mirror that to the other side. So if we add in our mirror modifier, you'll see nothing really happens. And that's because it's trying to mirror currently about the object origin, but our origin is right here and we want it to be right here. So let's instead, when we added that cube, let's move it in edit mode so that our origin stays right there in the middle. And now that's looking a little bit better. So we've got our origin right here. That's what things are rotating around. And when we add in our mirror modifier now, it'll come to the other side. So that's exactly what we want. So I'm going to also add in a skin modifier, and then we can see that it's very large. So I'll press A with everything selected and Control A to bring that down. And I really just want one piece to work with at this point. So I'm going to select this edge right here, for example. And then if you remember from previously, we'll press Control I to invert that selection. I'm going to press X and delete all those edges so that we just have this one edge. And now we've lost our skin modifier again. So remember, you can mark root to get that back. So let's just move this over and let's kind of just rotate things, move them around until we have sort of a nice shape for our chair. And so we have sort of a little bit more of a kind of mid-century style shape there. So that's looking good. Now I'd also like to create some arms and maybe some crossbars in the front here, but we'll do that with subdivision surface modeling, sort of similar to what we did with the cushion, but we'll also utilize a solidify modifier. So one thing I like to do a lot in Blender is steal geometry. So I already know that this has a subdivision and a mirror modifier on it. So rather than creating a new object and adding those, what I can do is press tab to go into edit mode, and then I'm just going to find a face that I think is going to work for my arm. So I'm just going to select that face. That looks good. Press Shift D to duplicate it, and then we have duplicated it, but let's just right click so it snaps back to where it is. And then before I deselect it, I'm gonna press P and separate it by selection. So now we have a new object, which is named ChairCush001, which is the name that's automatically generated. But let's just change that to chair arms. And now we have the arms for our chair. So remember, we want to do our modifications in edit mode so that our origin stays right in the middle. So I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode, bring this up, bring this over, select this edge, bring that to a nice place. And then just in my front view, let's kind of make sure we're looking right. And it can be a little hard to see here because of course this is just a singular plane. So let's add in our solidify modifier just to give it some thickness. And in this case, I think I actually want the solidify to happen. So right now we have it being mirrored first, which usually you want the mirror modifier first. And then we have it being subdivided and then it's being solidified, which that order works for me pretty well, but I might want to smooth it out again once after. So I might drop this down to 2 and then add in another subdivision surface so that it gets smoothed out at the very end. So something like that looks pretty good. But that's looking good. Let's steal a little bit more geometry from this armrest here. I'm going to show you how to do some leveling out. So I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate this piece, and then I want to move this down. And now I want to rotate it so that it's sort of straight forward. So I'm going to press R and X, and because that was already at a little bit of a weird angle, I don't know exactly what straight up would be. So you could press S and Y and then 0, and that will scale everything sort of along the Y-axis so that it's straight up and down. And we can see that now that is going exactly how I want it. So I'm just going to move that into place right there and then bring this piece over, and it's going to connect right there because again we have the merge option on. And then I'll just add in an edge loop right there, bring this over, and we've got sort of a nice shape, which of course you could add a little bit more detail if you wanted to by just maybe bringing that up, and that's looking pretty good. Maybe we want the same piece in the back, so let's select this whole thing, and a quick way to select all that would just be to press A, but of course we don't want the arm selected also, so I'm just going to hover over this and press L, and that will allow me to select linked islands, or you can think of L as the L in island. So now in my side view, I'll just duplicate this over and just rotate a little bit until we sort of have a nice shape there. And that's about it for our chair model. One other little detail we could add potentially would be going into this and adding like some cording around the outside. So the way I could do that is I'm just going to duplicate this and move it over. And I'm going to move this to a new collection, which I typically like to call the trash collection. And that's basically just, I want to save that model because what I'm about to do is a destructive process. So I'm going to apply the mirror modifier and the subdivision surface modifier because I want access to all the geometry. So you can see that's what the subdivision is actually creating. It's creating all these faces. And you can see why it's important to work with subdivision because you wouldn't want to have to control all those at once. But I just want to add a little bit more detail. So I'm going to use Alt and left click to select an edge ring. And I'll do that just in a couple places where we might naturally have some cording appearing on our model. So maybe right there and right there to select those edge rings. Now with those selected, I'll press Shift D to duplicate them and then P to separate by selection. And then with that selected, I can add in a skin modifier, tab into edit mode, select it all, and then Control A again is our hotkey to control the radius. And let's make sure we mark root on all those. And then maybe we add one more subdivision on top of that to smooth it all out. And we can check our smooth shading option. So now we have our model that's fully ready to be textured and add materials to. We've got some cording around the outside, and we've got our nice other objects that are ready to work with. So what we have now is a nice chair model that we created with a few different modeling techniques. Some we've used before, like skin modifier and the solidify modifier, and also we played a lot with the subdivision surface modifier. Meet me in the next lesson where we'll actually pull this all together into a room, add some more details, and create sort of a full environment that we can place our furniture into.